Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We're going through the Senate candidates because I believe that informed voters are the best voters. And today we have with us Congressman John Curtis. He's running for the Senate here in Utah. Glad to have him. John, how you been?
Awesome, Carson. It's just a delight to be on your show. And I'm looking forward to your very, very tough questions, which I know are coming.
Hey, I don't let anybody off the hook very easily, even if I do really like them. And so, but first, before we get started, I want to tell you thank you for a lot of things. And some people don't realize this. Your office is extremely effective. And we've ran into some problems in the past that come up on short notice, electronic ID for cattle,
Yeah.
mandatory labeling, and those types of things. Call your office on a Friday afternoon, and man, by Monday morning, they've been with Harriet Hageman. They've worked to undo those things. And I just want to say I do appreciate the work that you've done in that regard. And so, with that, you're on to the Senate. So, how did you get where you're at? And really, what has driven you to be where you
Yeah.
are today?
Well, Carson, that's a great question. Like literally, we could fill the whole period with that. But let me just say that I really my wheelhouse where I'm most comfortable is private sector business. I worked for a few people and had this entrepreneurial bug. Many people in Utah will relate to that and wanted to have my own business. When we sold it, the mayor of Provo had been really hard to work with, and that's probably the entry level for a lot of people into politics is something that bugs them. And that's what
Right.
bugged, yeah, that's what bugged me. So I jumped in and I ran for mayor. I said, you know what, we can do this better. And I just had a great experience. It just was a fun era for Provo. City prospered. We moved from that experience I had to the best city in America to do business. And I made the mistake when Jason Chaffetz resigned of thinking, well, if I like being mayor, I'll like being in Congress. It's going to be exactly the same. Right? And boy, was I caught off guard, if I'm honest. But I jumped in, and for the last 7 years, I've served in the House. As you know, I've just enjoyed every minute of that as well. But it's difficult. It's very different than being mayor. It's also legislative, where mayor was executive, and that was a shift for me too. And then, of course, when Mitt Romney resigned, and you'll enjoy this, when Jason resigned, I said, I'll never, ever, ever, ever do that.
Don't say never.
Several weeks later, I was a candidate, right? When
Right.
Mitt resigned, I said, "Oh, I would never, ever, ever, ever do that." And there are a lot of people, who were quite surprised that I did. And all I can say is, there are forces at play, and a lot of them are internal. That it's really hard to make that decision until you're in the throes of it. And so I did jump in last January, and here we are, just now a few days away from the primary.
Right. And it's been a long slog. And as I've talked to others and myself, being a candidate, it's not easy and it's
Right.
tough. I mean, it's a long slog from day one and it's up and down, especially on your side of it. You're back and forth to DC, then you're back and forth across the state, and you seem to show up at everything. I don't know how you do it, but you do. And that is something to be commended. And I want to thank everybody because it's an unthankful and terrible thing to campaign. Anybody who's done it knows
You
exactly
know, right?
what
Yeah.
well, but that is one perk of the Senate. Instead of campaigning every 2 years, you only have every 6 years. So that might not be a bad thing
I'm
either.
I'm not gonna lie. When people ask me why I would switch, there's a number of reasons, but you got to be honest. 6 year campaigns instead of 2 year campaigns in the House, that's all you do,
It's
right?
tough.
You finish one and you start the next one.
Yeah.
And I think it's we're fooling ourselves if you don't think that influences what you do and how you do it. And so the 6 year runway really is nice.
Yeah. No, and in politics, to really dive into it, in politics, people we tend to call these things problems. And so we always are talking about problems and we got
Right.
problems. But right now we do have problems and others I have talked about. And it's hard on the federal level because you're kind of finding that balance between local politics and federal. Where do those intersect? And how do federal policies affect Utah? And those things are important. And that's a hard line to navigate because in one hand, we don't like the federal government. We want them to go away. And on the other hand, they're in every facet of our lives and we have to deal with them. And so it's really hard to find that balance. But when you start to talk about problems and issues, and when you travel the state, what do you hear from people? Because I know what I hear from people. I hear the border, I hear inflation, I hear their families, they can't afford housing, they can't afford anything. And so those are two of the really big problems I hear. What else do you hear?
So I'll tell you, there's kind of like two levels, and let me tell you what I mean by that. Clearly, the border is number one right now.
Yeah.
Close to that is a combination of the economy, inflation, high prices, right? All of that.
Yeah.
But I used to kind of joke when I was mayor that the day we didn't pick up somebody's trash, that's all they cared about. They didn't care about taxes. They didn't care about anything else. And so, kind of to your point earlier, like the day that the federal government makes a rule that impacts you and your business, all of a sudden you don't care about the border, you don't care about inflation, you care about that.
Oh, yeah.
And and many of those seem like small issues, and they are on a district wide, but to that individual that day, I remember getting a call from a county commissioner, and he said, look, because of the drought, we run our cattle on certain dates given to us by the BLM, but because of the drought, those dates don't work. Can you get those dates changed? On that day, that's right. Like
That's all that matters.
that's all that matters. And I think one of the things that's unfortunate about a campaign like this is it tends to focus on what's your position on the border, what's your position on right, and those are important. But I think rarely do we look under the hood to say what's going to happen the day. And I'll give you some real life examples. The day that my son is stuck in a country and has lost his passport, or they've closed down the border, like, can you help? Right. And
Yeah.
those are the phone calls we get every day.
Yeah. No, and that's hard. But when we look at the southern border, because again, this is a hot topic on everybody's mind. We've seen tens of millions of people crossing the
Yep.
border. The
Yep.
Biden administration has completely dropped the ball. They are guilty as charged. They are handling this with malfeasance. When you go from the numbers under Trump and the things that were happening, Trump is here to there. I've been a big Trump fan since day one. I appreciate his border policy. And I remember a point in time when we couldn't find $6 billion to fund our own wall, let alone funding everybody else's walls now to secure their borders. But under the Trump administration, we saw record low people crossing the border. We were cracking down on it and we were working towards it. But there's a fine balance we have to have. What's happening right now is ridiculous. I mean, it is out of control. But there is also a major need for legal immigration because our legal immigration system is absolutely broken. Because when you look at us, we rely on migrant workers. And we have H-2A guys that come here and they herd sheep for us. They do it legally. We go through the process, but we're talking 8, 9, 10 months of paperwork back and forth, tens of
Yep.
thousands of dollars to do it correctly. And they're still getting sent back at the consulate. We're still having trouble getting them here. And yet, we jokingly say, get him a flight to Mexico City. We'll pick him up at the border and they'll hand him a cell phone and a debit card and say, yeah, see you in 6 or 8 years. And so that's the hard part that we're finding right now. So what do you see as the solution? Where's the starting point?
Yeah.
How do we, where do we start?
Yeah, so the starting point is easy, and it took me a while. Although it's easy, I'll tell you, it took me a little while to figure this out, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. I was proposing bills to fix the problem, the last problem that you talked about, which is that you can't get workers, hospitality can't get workers, high tech can't get workers. You look across the state, they can't get workers. And I had some really good bills. And I talked to Jim Jordan one day, who was over the committee holding these up. He looked at me and he basically said, until that border's solved, I'm not touching any of these bills. And the reality of it is, my colleagues here in Washington are not willing to consider any reform until we stop this crazy flow. So
Yeah.
mission number one, to answer your question, is stop the flow. It's not that hard, Carson. Look, I was down there several months ago. I heard from Border Patrol. I heard from sheriffs. I heard from everybody. Remain in Mexico.
Yeah.
It's one thing. Like there's a whole bunch of things that we would like to do. But if we did one thing, and that's remain in Mexico, 90% of this goes away because you take away the incentive to come. Right now, all they have to do is show up at that border, claim asylum, and then we let them in for 10 years. And so they're going to do that. If instead of letting them in, we send them back to Mexico to wait for that, then their motivation is gone. And so we could do that tomorrow. The reality of it is Biden, not only are all the things you said true, but he's been very deceptive about this, which is he keeps trying to blame it on Republicans and on Congress.
And on Trump.
And Trump. Look, all he has to do is pick one of the things that Donald Trump did, just one, which is remain in Mexico.
Yeah.
And 90% of this goes away. And the reality of it, if 90% of it goes away, although it's not 100, now we're ready to talk about serious immigration reform. which
Mhm.
is getting the right people in here when we want them to do the things that we want them to do.
No, and I've told
And
people this. I say you come home and your house is flooding. The first thing you do is not grab a bucket and start bailing. The first thing you do is shut the water off.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah, that's a good analogy. And that's
yeah,
exactly. And then once you shut the water off, okay, now we can talk about, okay, where do we get a bucket? How big is the bucket? Right? Like,
yeah.
uh, how
Do
many
we need a
people we
pump?
got?
How are we
Yeah,
going to
yeah.
fix this?
And there are lots of ideas. And I've got some, let me just share for the fun of it. One of the things I would do, and I think this is a really not only practical, but a doable idea. I call it my state-sponsored visa program. And in essence, what it would do is it would give governors blocks of visas that they controlled. And not only did they control, but they would be responsible for following the individuals that they give the visas to. Because right now, a lot of my colleagues don't like visas because we don't track them and follow them and they disappear. But if the governor of a state said, look, I'll take X number of visas, and at the end of that year, I can tell you where 99% of the people are that I gave visas. Okay, we're going to let you do that next year again, and we're actually going to give you more visas. It's called my state-sponsored visa bill. It's just one example of how we can beat this system. And I think overall, it's a mistake because we tend to look at people in one category. Some people want to come here for citizenship. Some people simply want to come and work.
Yeah.
I think we need to divide that line more and say, look, we're for the people who want to come here and live, we have this is what we're looking for. For people that come here and want to work, it's totally different. And there's as you well know, because many of them probably have worked for you, a lot of people want to come here and work and go back home.
They do. Yeah.
And
And it's tough
yeah.
because it's come here, stay here for 2 or 3 years at a time. For sheep herder H2As, it's 3 years. That's a long time away from their families. They want to be able to go back, visit their family for a month or two, and then come back again, which I don't see the problem with that. But the paperwork and the processes for getting to that point is ridiculous, and they don't do it. They come here for the American dream. They come here to live a better life. I mean, by our standards here in the United States, they don't get paid very much. I mean, we pay them a fair wage, but they turn around and that's 4 or 5 times what they would make in a single month down there. So they send that money to their families and they're doing phenomenal. It gives their children an opportunity to go to school. It gives their families I mean, we are literally helping the rest of the world when we do this and combating poverty and doing such great things that come with it at no expense and actually adding to the United States. And this is where I think we have to take a step back and take a strong look at it, because immigration reform, again, shut it off, but then immigration reform should be at the top of the heap. Again, so that's a big one I hear from lots of people. But the other one is inflation right now. I think they've estimated that $11,000 to $12,000 a year more it's costing to be able to live, simply live. I mean, you've seen it. I've seen it. I go to the grocery store. I have 5 little girls, and they are hungry little buggers. And man, they eat a lot, but it's costing us 1,000, 1,500 more a month to feed them this year than it was a year and a half ago. How do we combat inflation? Where do we start? Because we're looking at the national debt and it does nothing but climb. And these omnibus spending bills, I mean, we're at 34, $35 trillion now. We're not doing anything really that seems to slow it. How do we get control of that? And how do we bring it back? I know we're asking for big answers, but
No, they're not that hard. First of all, just be glad you have four girls and not four boys.
right.
As a dad of four boys and two girls, the boys eat a whole lot more than the girls.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah.
when I was in college, my professor taught me that inflation is the result of too much money chasing too few good.
Yeah.
So what are we doing? We've got this faucet of spending turned on, and trillions of dollars are being flooded into the market. And at the same time, we are over restricting the supply chain. So our responsibility in Washington, D.C. is in Congress, this is one we need to own, is to stop that flow, make that a reasonable flow, right?
Sure.
Reduce that, which also now comes to the whole deficit issue. And at the same time, it's not enough just to do that. We have to free up the supply chain. When President Trump was president in his first few years, and I served with him, we removed more government regulations than all administrations combined before him. And
Absolutely.
I had the luxury of being here when we voted for tax reform, and I'd come back to the district and I'd kind of beg for a compliment. I'd say, how do you like that tax reform? Thinking that they would compliment me. And almost without exception, they said, tax reform is nice, but what has really made a difference is the deregulation.
Deregulation. Absolutely.
Take the handcuffs off.
Yeah.
And and our economy flourished in that dual role of low taxes and low regulation. That's how we get rid of inflation, is take the handcuffs off, let that supply chain loosen up and pull back the money. And inflation, it's not just as simple as, we're gonna do it and it's gonna happen. There is a lag to this, but the sooner we start it, the quicker we get to that lag and start bringing this inflation down.
To me, there are very few problems that can't be solved by deregulating. I mean, overregulation is killing everything, and that's where a lot of folks get worried about what's happening and what's coming down the pipe and how these things are going to happen. And in Congress, you're known as the climate Republican. You've never shied away from that. You're very
Don't
proud,
tell
right?
anybody.
Right, right. No, what's funny is John. I'll tell a little funny side story. A couple of years ago, John invited me to speak. They held the climate summit, and I was invited to speak there and join the main panel. And I think the first words out of my mouth were, "I don't believe that man-made climate change is an existential threat to humans." That was my opening statement, and I still stand by that statement. But I also see the need to engage in this discussion because, as I've told others, my daughter came home from school in sixth grade and she said to me, she said, "Hey, my teacher said that cows are bad for the environment and we need to stop eating meat." And I said, this is asinine. I mean, if they really want to have this discussion, let's have this discussion. If we'll meet them on their terms, and I can say, you know what? Here's the deal. It has been proven time and time again that if you want to sequester carbon from the atmosphere, the best way to do it is by grazing livestock, growing corn. I mean, the America's Corn Belt puts out more and takes out more CO2 out of the atmosphere than the Amazon rainforest during peak growing season. So agriculture is the only industry that has been proven to be net zero or taking out more carbon from the atmosphere than it produces if they want to have that discussion. But yet agriculture seems to be the big one. And I know you have really engaged in that discussion. Tell them about the climate caucus. Tell them about what you've done there. And then there's a few more things I want to talk about.
Yeah, so thank you for that and for the introduction. Listen, when I came to Congress, I represented Carbon County and Emery County coal, right? And then after redistricting, they gave me the basin, which is oil and gas. And so why is it the guy that represents coal, oil, and gas talking climate? And the answer is very simple. Just as you mentioned, agriculture is being blamed for this. Fossil fuels are being demonized and blamed for this as well. And I love to ask the question of people: do you hate fossil fuels or do you hate emissions? Look, we can all agree as Republicans to a couple of things. We want to leave the earth better than we found it. Easy, right? Less pollution is better than more pollution. Clean air matters to us. Clean water matters to us. And the problem is Republicans have been so turned off by the extremism of the Green New Deal and the extremism on the far left that they haven't engaged. And when you don't engage, your teachers teach the things that your daughter learned. And
Right.
so we really want is our kids going to school and learning principles about, yes, we do want to be good stewards. We do want to leave this earth better than we found it. By the way, if you care about emissions, did you know that corn, and then you share what you shared. By the way, did you know that US fossil fuels are 40% cleaner than Russian natural gas? So if we simply shipped US natural gas overseas to replace Russian natural gas, we would reduce more emissions than the entire Green New Deal. And because Republicans don't talk about that, we're not comfortable putting those things forward. And I just believe in my heart, I'm going to insult everybody that's listening to this. Utah, and quite frankly, particularly ag, are our original environmentalists, right? Like,
100%.
now, they don't like to be called environmentalists because the name has been tainted.
Right.
But right, but you show me somebody that does what you do, that doesn't, your livelihood depends on you leaving that land better than you found it for your generations. Otherwise, you're killing the future generations. You know
But even
that.
for next year, like if
Yeah,
it's not there next year, we don't survive. Our animals
yeah,
don't survive. Our crops don't grow. Like we want it better than we found it.
yeah. And so I've tried to get Republicans to engage on this, because when we don't, there's nobody at the table to push back on bad ideas. And let me give you a couple of examples of those bad ideas. In Europe, they decided 20 years ago that nuclear was bad. The environmentalists said nuclear is bad, shut it down. Well, they replaced that nuclear with Russian dirty petroleum products, putting out more emissions. just 15 years ago, Europe produced as much natural gas as Russia, but they decided they were too good to frack. So today they buy fracked natural gas from an enemy, Russia. And
Right.
those are the same decisions that are being made here in the United States. If we're not at that table pushing back, that's where we head. And today, Europe is in a really bad place. They're putting out more emissions than before they even started. Their prices are incredibly high. You think they're high here? Go to Europe. It's
Yeah.
unreliable. The power is unreliable. And what they do have that's reliable is coming from an enemy holding them, hostage. So that's why John Curtis talks climate, and I do try to get Republicans to just be more comfortable with it. I know it makes them uncomfortable. Just the word makes them uncomfortable. But
Yeah.
my feeling is if we're not comfortable talking about it, we lose.
Sure. No, and I think you're absolutely right. But I think there are some people who rightfully so are worried about some things. And something came across my desk the other day, and I'll look here what it was called, but it was flagged by a farmer advocacy group. And I don't know if you delve into it a bunch, but it was the Prove It Act. And it follows on the back of the CBAM, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which was implemented in Europe. And we were I talked to my friend Ava Vlardingerbrock. She talks about the Dutch farmers. She's a big coverage of that and the nitrogen bans. And you saw the protests. You saw what happens when they make it unable for farmers to farm, to make a living. And so I worry about, and these advocacy groups are worried about the Prove It Act. And they wonder what that's going to do for farming and agriculture. Because if the last thing the United States can take right now is a carbon tax, and everybody sees the Prove It Act as a gateway to a carbon tax because that's what happened in Europe. And they said, "Oh, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to take a carbon tax. We're just doing a study on it." Well, with that study, then came the carbon taxes. And now I have friends in Europe who are having to get rid of half their sheep. There's farmers in Ireland who are having to get rid of half of their dairy herds because of the implementation of that, because we know where this train stops and these progressive policies end up. And all of us want to do better. All of us want to make a better country, but we can't do it at the detriment of our domestic industry, at the detriment of agriculture, because agriculture in the United States, 0.6% of the population now feeds the rest of them. And we are losing hundreds of thousands of farms every year. Acts like this, in my opinion, will take those away. And so, where do you stand on that? How do you see? Because you may know more about me. I haven't.
Right.
Like again, it just came across my desk yesterday.
I love the question. I actually know a ton about Prove It Act, and so
Okay,
let me give you kind of a different perspective. So the Prove It Act does ask for a study of carbon intensity of U.S. industries. I think it picks 6 major industries like cement and and steel and things like that. And you also mentioned now, so why would we do a study? So first of all, this data already exists. It's just not by the federal government. The Biden administration is already doing a study. So my question is like, okay, whose numbers do we want to use? Because you mentioned the CBAM in Europe. Europe will start taxing US on carbon for exports to Europe with their numbers. So remember, if we have a study and it's done right and it's by us, they use our numbers. And so in the actual language of the Prove It Act, it says it cannot be used for a carbon tax because it's really important that people not see that this is, because I'm with you on a carbon tax.
sure,
It's a terrible, terrible idea. We want to make sure that the Prove It Act is not a forerunner to a carbon tax, but we also want to make sure that the data is not the Biden administration data. We want to make sure it's not Europe's data. We want to make sure it's not even private sector data. We want to make sure that Congress determines the study so that we can show that to Europe. The other thing is that we're competing against China in a real serious way. We clean their clock in every single one of these categories. So by having this data, I sat with President Trump yesterday and he wants to put massive tariffs on China.
good.
And, and so, but think about this, the unevenness of our ag and all of our industries competing against China when they have no restrictions on emissions, they have no restrictions on human rights, they have no restrictions on OSHA or all these other things
Sure.
that we do here in the
Labor
United States.
laws,
Yeah,
immigration,
yeah.
ethical
So
practices,
yeah,
anything.
so without this data, we're not able to hold them accountable. Without this data, we're not able to push back on Europe. So I think the answer to your question is, okay, how do we get the data without it being a forerunner to a carbon tax? And the reality of it is, I'm just telling you, carbon tax is dead, dead, dead. Democrats don't even like a carbon tax. Now, there are people out there who do like it, obviously, but I don't know a single Republican. Well, I won't. I do know a few, but generally speaking, Republicans are very opposed to a carbon tax, and Democrats are. So I would kind of say, look, let's figure out how to give people the assurance that this isn't a forerunner to a carbon tax. Let's make sure the data is good and that it's collected in a way that we can trust, and that we then use that to help you as businesses.
Yeah, because people are leery, and rightfully so. I mean, the
Oh, I
Europeans
totally,
are are
yeah.
are screaming about it right now. I mean, you look at mandatory RFID for animals. They started that in Europe. I mean, in Europe, they make it so stringent to raise livestock anymore, and it all started with the implementation of mandatory RFID. Well, in this last omnibus funding, you know what there was? There was $15 million, and I know your office has been working on that to pull that out with Hageman's office and with Celeste Malloy's office, but regardless, they're trying to push that, and that's where it begins. So when they see something like the Prove It Act and what happened with the CBAM in Europe, they're like, okay, red
No,
flags go up. And for me, immediately red flags go up because here in the state, 67% of the state is owned by the federal government. Most of that is used for mineral extraction or for livestock grazing. And when the federal government, we have found that these unelected bureaucrats are not good at what they do.
yeah.
They do a terrible job at it, and they get very heavy-handed. And so they will take away that autonomy in the name of carbon reduction or whatever. If you don't meet their carbon emissions, you don't graze on public land. If you don't meet their carbon emissions, you don't mine. And so rightfully so, I think a lot of people are worried. And again, I see these things come across. We want better data. We want to show because I believe that we're on the right side of things. And again, like you said, we're being made to compete on the world stage with our hands tied behind our back. And so President Trump's tariffs, I mean, that is excellent. I think that that's of the utmost importance until we're being able to play on a level playing field. Because for me, I said this in my convention speech and say it again. Show me one place in this country where life is better because the Democrats are in charge. Because you look at blue cities, you look at blue states, and they're all being run into the ground. And these progressive policies, and I'll push that even further. Look in Europe, look at the progressive policies. Look at Argentina, what he's done over the last, they have pulled these progressive policies. Show me,
Venezuela,
yeah,
Venezuela.
show me one place in this world where these progressive ideologies are making life better for people. And that is where I believe that we're at right now. And so, again, when it comes to the Prove It Act, I just see it as okay, we have to assure that this is not a gateway. And to some people, that is don't even let it get started anymore because once they get their hands in it, they don't because Democrats seem to put forward 150% of what they want. They take out 50 and they still got exactly what they wanted. And so, we as Republicans, I believe, have to push back on that notion and say, you know what, this is where we're going to stand. This is how we're going to fight. That's my opinion of all this. But again, people are leery, and I wanted your take on it.
Yeah. And I just end with like the data exists, so let's make sure it's good data,
Yeah.
right?
And I agree with what you say. When it comes to having a seat at the table, for far too long, we've thrown our hands up in the air. It's a huge issue. Climate change, these kids are coming out of school believing that
Yep.
climate change is going to end their lives. And they're not going to have a life or children because the
Yeah,
climate
it's
monster is going to eat them. And so if we're not engaging in it, we're not bringing in
we're
voters,
losing.
but we
We're
we
losing.
don't have to play by their rules. We don't have to accept the terms as they set them because most of the time they're wrong. And we have to put forward our solutions so these people can listen, so that they can see what we're doing and they can see that we care about the environment because it's not about lack of care. We just disagree with what they're talking about because
And
these green energies are killing us.
that's such an important point. And this is another thing I'm trying to change is our reputation of not caring. Because we don't talk about it, that we're then branded as not caring. And this is like where my head wants to explode. Like you show me anybody in Utah who doesn't care. So let's
Yeah.
have a thoughtful debate about what to do about it. Right. That's the whole point. And okay, so here's my solutions. And by the way, my solutions don't include destroying ag. It doesn't destroying fossil fuels. It keeps us energy, not just independent, energy dominant. And oh, by the way, it also reduces emissions.
Yeah.
And Republicans have never been willing to concede that because we feel like, oh, if we concede that reducing emissions is important, then we have to jump to the Green New Deal. And I
Yeah.
think what I'm show Republicans is, look, there's a place to land here that does all the things I just mentioned. And by the way, it reduces emissions.
Yeah, no, and here's my other point, and I know we're going long on this category, but I think it's so important because if this was really about the environment, you know how much that Green New Deal we could have put into taking plastic out of the ocean and cleaning up the environment that way, it would have been done. Problem would have been solved. But no, we're chasing something that we have no data on, or that the data is contrary to, because that's what they want to do. And that is where a lot of people are getting burned on it. And they frankly had enough of this crackdown from the top. Again, you see these solar fields that are coming on and the government subsidies that are going into those. For me, I always look at it as, if it can't survive on its own, it's probably a bad idea. If it requires government subsidies or it doesn't survive, we're probably in a bad spot, because it's not. And a lot of these green energy, they're not meeting the demands, and they can't meet the demands. You look at Texas during that winter storm they had a couple years ago. It literally put people's lives in jeopardy and or ended people's lives because they didn't have energy, because the wind and the solar was not working. It's a stable, steady, I mean, the basis of any society is a stable and steady supply of electricity and energy that they can depend on. And we're just not there yet. And when nuclear is there, those are the things we should be pushing towards, in my opinion.
So just quickly, and I know you want to move on, but there's a data center that wants to come into Utah County. The power needed for that data center is 1.5 gigawatts. Now, that won't mean a lot to your listeners, but
Oof.
for reference, the entire state of Wyoming uses 1 gigawatt. So
Yeah.
you're one and a half times for one data center. And
Yeah.
so we are fooling ourselves if we think, okay, we're going to do that with solar panels. The reality of it is we're going to need all the renewables we can get. We're going to need all the fossil fuels we can get. We're going to need all the nuclear we can get. And by the way, the market itself is driving all of these things, including fossil fuels, to cleaner and cleaner and cleaner. And I actually believe by 2050, we'll be using nuclear, geothermal, renewables, fossil fuels, and we will be doing very few emissions because the market is driving that. But
Yeah.
it's the market, not government, right, that we want to drive that. And if the market drives that, great.
Sure. And that brings me to another point in this. It's incentivizing efficiencies. For so long, we've seen the EPA and those penalizing people and implementing standards that aren't actually helping. They're actually, I go back to pickups and I go back to diesel engines because I have a degree in diesel mechanics and I understand how this works. I mean, you look around 07, 08, prior to tier one emissions, we were starting to get vehicles that were getting 21, 22, 23 miles to the gallon in the light to mid duty pickup range. And the efficiencies were going up with the high pressure injection systems. We were using half the fuel, but tier one emissions come in, that doubled. It took cut in half the efficiency of these engines. And so now we're using twice as many fossil fuels at the same times. And so I've always seen it as, if this were about efficiencies, let's incentivize. Why not give companies tax breaks for efficiencies? Why not say, hey, if you can meet this X amount of efficiency, by all means, we're going to give you a tax break. We're going to incentivize you to be efficient, not penalize you for what you're doing on the other end. And I really believe that that is the way forward. And you would see companies making races to make these engines efficient, to make them use. I mean, if you could double the amount of miles per gallon these vehicles are getting, you then cut your fossil fuel usage in half. It's that
Yeah.
simple.
So another way to say that, if I, and I'm going to say what you said in a different way, is like, okay, let's go out to the year 2050 and what are our goals for fuel? We know it's a mistake if we don't include affordability. And that's what Europe did, right? So goal number one is affordability. We know it's a mistake if we don't include reliability. It's one of
Yeah.
the problems with renewables. So goal number two is reliability. The market is driving clean, and Republicans need to acknowledge that the market is also driving clean. So if we simply stood back and said, let the market forces take us to 2050, and whoever gets there with affordability, reliability, and clean wins,
Yeah.
you better bet the market would deliver
Oh yeah.
affordability, reliability, and clean, right?
Yeah.
And line everybody up and say go, right? And
Yeah.
we're not going to put it. And instead of right now, what we're doing is actually putting a roadblock in front of some of them and turbocharging others. And
Yep.
EVs is a really good example. Look,
Government's picking winners and losers.
let me give a disclaimer. I would love an EV, right? I'd have nothing against EVs. they have not been proven to be the best at affordable, reliable, clean. They just haven't.
Bingo.
And so let them, right, let the market. Quite frankly, a hybrid, by the way, is far cleaner for the environment than an EV. So let the market drive this, get out of the way. If there are going to be government incentives, just do it across, like give them all
Yeah.
the advantage. And for instance, nuclear is a really good example. So we know we need a lot of nuclear for the future, but because we took a generation off, we are way behind on nuclear. So I'm
Yep.
okay with some nudging from government on nuclear. We've got to make it easier to permit, right?
Yeah.
And we lost a whole generation. We're now competing on a worldwide basis where we lost a generation. It's because government got in the way, right?
Again, overregulation.
Yeah. But anyway, so boy, you and I could talk about this for several
Oh,
hours, but I know you want to
and
move.
now, and that's just it. But I believe it's so important to the discussion. But back in there, you mentioned something about the Trump tariffs, and that's something I want to talk about now is American industry and kind of the America first look. Because for a lot of time now, we've been incentivizing imports, and we've been incentivizing a lot of things that have weakened our manufacturing sector, weakened our agriculture sector. Again, to your office's credit, your credit, we came to you last year talking about the trade imbalance in the sheep industry and how detrimental it is that these trade partners of us are taking such advantage. We run a massive trade deficit to Australia, New Zealand, yet they are shipping lamb here for prices that we cannot even begin to meet because of trade imbalances. The dollar, the American dollar is still so strong that that trade imbalance it creates. So when we look at the Trump trade look at the tariffs they placed on China. I actually had this discussion with Mike Pence once, and I don't know if he loved it all that much, but it was pretty entertaining because he wanted to get rid of that tariff. And I said, no, that is wrong. And we were at a dinner with a lot of people. I probably won't be invited back again. But I said, you know, that's wrong. And I said, because by your own standard, the Trump era trade was working. And to Trump's credit and to Lighthizer credit and his trade team, they did a phenomenal job. And they said, you know what? The retaliation is going to be tough. They're going to cut imports, and it actually came down to agriculture. They said they're going to cut imports of corn and soybeans, and they did. China cut the imports by $27 billion, but yet the trade tariffs brought us in $50 billion. They said, okay, it'll come back. Sure enough, the next year it was back down to about $14 billion deficit. The year after, it was back to zero, and now they're actually importing more corn and soybeans than they were prior to the tariffs. And what that tells me is these other countries need us. They have to have the United States. But yet, for so long, we have let them take advantage of us. We have let them overrun our markets. If you want to play in our market, let's play on an even playing field. Everybody says fair trade. Well, to me, there's no such thing as fair trade anymore because they're, like you talked about a minute ago, they're not meeting the same standards as we are. Their labor laws, their climate whatever we're being forced to meet, the Paris agreements, all of those things, these other countries, they're not adhering to, but yet we shackle ourselves with those, and then we're stuck with it. And so, with that, what are you at on tariffs? Because this past year, we've actually seen more bills on tariffs, especially in agriculture, than any in the last 30 years, I believe. I mean, Senate Ways and Means, they are Ways and Means is pushing for Senate Finance, sorry, and House Ways and Means. They are putting bills in, which is almost unprecedented.
Yeah, so let me respond to that and say I was the first to complain about the Trump tariffs because I was getting clobbered by businesses calling my office and saying, "You're killing me." Because as you referred to, right, like a lot of our businesses were importing very cheap things from China, using them in their product, and that changed when that happened. What people couldn't see is how dependent we were at the time on China. And the Trump tariffs woke people up to how dependent we were. And then guess what comes COVID? And
Yeah.
everybody who had moved their supply chain during the Trump tariffs were glad that
Oh,
they
I'll
had.
bet.
And so, like, one of the things about President Trump is sometimes you have to say, is he dumb lucky or is he smart, right? Like, because how did he know that what he did with tariffs was going to prepare our country for COVID? Is that dumb
Yeah.
lucky or right, or was that smart?
Or
But
do
it
you
did
see something coming? Yeah.
in many ways. So now think about one of the analogies I like to use is think about a toaster. So you go into Walmart and you want to buy a toaster, and hypothetically, you see a toaster for $20 and one for $10. Well, we buy the $10 toaster all day long. It's made in China.
Yeah.
No human rights standards, no emission standards, no OSHA standards, often slave, even possibly slave labor.
Uyghur slave labor. Yeah.
Yeah. And so how does somebody make a toaster in the United States when they have to put it on the shelf for 20 bucks? And so like one of the things is like, well, maybe we should even just put a label on that toaster, right? Like, in this is, human rights violations and all those things like that.
Yeah.
But
Disclaimer.
yeah, but like, let me just float an idea without getting in trouble with some of your listeners. A border tax adjustment, which is basically saying at the border, we're going to account for the difference in human rights. We're going to account for the difference in no OSHA. Every regulation we put on a US business, we are going to demand that of people that import into the United States, or we're going to put an appropriate fee on for that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
And
We've talked about this in the agriculture sector. It's the tariff rate quota system.
yeah,
We're being forced to play at a certain level. Other countries are subsidizing, yet we're still competing with them. They don't have the same standards we are, especially when it comes to the slaughter and processing. We don't know these Central and South America countries, they are not meeting the same FDA standards that we are here. But you know what they do? They ship it to the United States. They pull it from one box, put it in a different box, label it product of the USA, and kick it out into our market. And that's what we're dealing with.
now let me come full circle and say this is another reason for Prove It Act, because we want to prove it that where we are as the United States, so that when somebody's coming in and they're inferior to us, we can then document that. And so, I'm a little like, I'm not yet a full convert to border adjustment, but I think you cannot have a conversation about leveling the playing field without it. And I think President Trump would be really powerful if he figured this out and
Yeah.
make it more. But so part of the problem was like, let's not make it only about carbon. I want to make it about every difference, this difference between what you're doing and what we're doing, so that you can manufacture a toaster in the United States, so that you can produce, ag and
And
meat.
cutting those regulations to do so.
Yeah. And here's another thing, like, well, if we don't care if that toaster doesn't have those regulations on it, why do we care that a US business has those regulations? It should be, we either care or we don't care, right?
Sure.
If you don't care, take them off US business,
Yeah.
right? If you care, force them on the businesses. And in your business, there are some really important government regulations that make sure consumers know that what they're eating is safe. So we're not talking about peeling back like all
Oh, yeah.
regulations, right? But there are good regulations and bad regulations. But if we don't demand them on the product coming in, why are we demanding it on a US business?
Oh, 100%. And that's where it comes back to when we advance this conversation, where I want to go with it next is with so much government and federal land owned in the state of Utah. It's like, where do we go next? Because they are controlling all of these metrics. It used to be politics was just kind of ants here and there, but now it's involved in everything. It's in every facet, and especially here in the state when it starts to come to growth and what's coming next and those regulations. If we're not meeting those, the federal government, they have a pretty strong hand in what they do and what happens here in the state. So when it comes to control, everybody wants to about this one, and it's a hot topic, but it's control and getting back the states' lands and returning the federal lands inside the states back to the states. What do you see as a viable solution there? Because we all know that the federal government's big, it's clunky. Most of the people who are writing the forest plans and the grazing plans, they have never even stepped foot in our forest. They have never been there. They learned something in a book in college, and they come here and try to tell us how to manage land that we have been on for 6 generations now. And again, these taxes, these carbon stuff, it comes back to it could make it so it doesn't make it 7 generations, and they could come in, and we are very, very leery about the implementation of carbon tax. I mean, if you want to see the beltway filled with tractors in DC, keep pushing down this road of these carbon taxes. So the ag sector does get very leery, but it's especially important here in Utah. So back to that question, where do you see us going? How can we kind of push back on that federal control of our lands, and where does the state play a role in that?
So you're hitting an area where not just me, but my staff spend a high percentage of our time. in the third congressional district, once you're outside of Utah County and Salt Lake County, 90% of the land is owned by the federal government. So like when you hear 2/3 of the state, that's fine, but that's counting some counties with hardly any. And
With
that is,
yeah, Salt Lake County.
yeah. So now let's go to rural Utah where it's 90%. And I love to say back here to my colleagues, all right, I want you to stop and think about running a county when 90% of your property tax doesn't pay or excuse me, 90% of your property doesn't pay property tax. I want you to think about running a county where you can't, when 90% of your land takes 10 years to permit a road, right?
Yeah.
Run a county when at a whim, the BLM can take grazing rights back, right?
Yeah.
Like just try to run a county like this. And the problem is on
Try to run
the
a life like this.
yeah,
I mean,
east of the Mississippi, about 4% of the land belongs to the federal government. West of the Mississippi, the problem is we have far few legislators from west of the Mississippi.
sure.
And particularly between Mississippi and Nevada, like lop off California, right? Doesn't count. And so we really struggle trying to get this message across. And so number one is like we have to do a better job of getting our colleagues to understand what they're putting on top of us. Two, we have to hold the federal government accountable for owning so much land. Try this on for an idea. Imagine if the federal land in Utah paid property tax at the same rate as
Yep.
as private land. Now that you know the payment in lieu of taxes, you know about that. So there
Yep.
is some
Yep.
money, but it's a fraction, right?
Yeah.
And
It's
so
nothing.
I guarantee you, you'd have a lot of county commissioners stop complaining about federal land
Oh, I
if it
guarantee it.
if
But
they
you'd have the
simply
federal government trying to get rid of a lot of federal land
and
too.
likewise, you're right. And it would totally change the dynamic. Well, if why shouldn't it pay the same rate as the private people east of the Mississippi are paying, right, on property tax? So there's one thought. The other thought is, okay, we clearly everybody knows we have to get rid of the Antiquities Act. We could have a very long conversation about that. And
Sure.
then we've got to fight back. So you know about the BLM conservation rule right now is a really good example of just rule after rule, executive rule, that if your legislators are not on their game, gets pulled off and builds and builds and builds and builds. So we have to be constantly on the offense, not just defense, but on the offense of this. And it's really all of the above that we cannot rest. I think one of the very most important things the federal delegation does in Utah, both in the House and the Senate, is a 24/7 watch on public lands and pushing back and taking it, and when we can take it back. I've transferred more land from federal ownership to state than anyone in the state's history, and I'm embarrassed how little that is. And
Yeah.
I'm still the winner, right?
Right.
And and so okay, yeah, we do everything we can do there. We work on the Antiquities Act. We fight all these different things. We push for better PILT compensation, and we educate our other colleagues around the country constantly on what's
Right.
happening here in Utah. And I'm just telling you, if your federal delegation does nothing else and they were successful at that, they would earn their money.
Oh, 100%, because it is a tough fight, and nobody really wants to engage it. But I believe it's time that the states to start asserting their rights, because when you lock people off the lands, when you lock them off, I mean, anything that's worth a value in this world comes from the ground at one point or another. I mean, we're
Yes,
talking
so
it's either mined or drilled for, it's
energy,
extracted, it's stored.
right?
Yeah, it's water, it's all of these things, but yet the EPA is controlling them. These bureaucrats are controlling them, and when you lock these Utahns off there, you lock us from our ability to create and enlarge our economy, to bring our life standards up, to bring jobs to Utah and move them out of the city to rural Utah. We're talking about, diversifying our economy. These things are of the utmost importance to the survival and to our national security. In my opinion, I mean, food security is national security, energy security is national security, because the world is looking at us wondering what's going on right now, because the world looks to the United States and we really are the gold standard, and everybody's looking to us. And if our cup isn't full, we don't fill anybody else's. But right now we are putting ourselves into a position where we can help nobody. And we are, what is it, next year? It's going to be the largest expenditure we have is servicing the debt on our national debt, servicing the interest on our national debt. We're in trouble. and we have to slow the spending. So I think that's another thing I'd like to talk to you about, because you've seen it escalate and you've seen it probably in your time. I don't know, where was it when you started and where is it now? But what do we do? I mean, you come home and your house is flooding. What do you do? It's this.
So, listen, we need to be honest as Republicans. We've blamed the debt on Democrats for a very long time. It's not like we're hypocritical by doing that. The debt increased under President Trump. Like, love him, hate him, we just have to admit we
Sure.
spent too much. We spent way too much money. And so the reality of it is that Republicans and Democrats just have to stop, and constituents have to stop asking for it. Does that make sense? It like everybody owns this. You can say like it's blame it on us,
Oh,
and it's
yeah.
fair to blame it on us.
There's a lot of people with their hand out saying, come
But
on.
we are responding to the people knocking on our door, if that makes
Yep.
sense. And so, we're also not honest. Like you hear a dialogue, you've heard both presidents say we're not touching Social Security. We
Right.
are touching it, right? So
Right.
this is where, you talk about the flood in the house. The reality of it is, if you talk about government programs, it's a drip, drip, drip in the faucet. If you
Yep.
talk about Social Security and Medicare, it is the fire hose flooding the house. So every year we spend massive, massive amounts of time and dialogue on the drip, drip, drip. Okay, I
Yeah.
agree, it's important, but nobody's paying attention to the fire hose. And the reality of it is, it's not that hard. I'll give you a really good example. Social Security. Look, let's do three things. Let's lift the age when people are eligible, not people that are in retirement. We're not going to mess with your retirement. Don't worry. Not people a couple of years away from retirement. We're going to go to my kids, their age, and say, we're changing the eligibility age. We're moving it 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, whatever. You know what? They don't care, because they don't think they're going to have it anyway. Right.
Right.
The second thing we need to do is we take money out of people's paychecks, and there's a cap on that. It's time to move that cap and probably move it substantially. They don't care, right? They're okay with that. Third thing we need to do is we're tying the return rate to bonds and not bonds and equities. And simply doing those three things would do more for the national debt than eliminating all bad spending. Now, I'm with you on reducing all bad spending. I'm not making a
Sure.
case about doing that, but I'm saying unless you do both, you're fooling yourself. And I think Congress is finally getting closer, but you'll hear from the top, like I say, both presidents have said we're not touching Social Security. I think that's wrong, and I think we've got to do that. When I was mayor, we had to cut the budget, and we cut it dramatically. I told people every penny mattered, and it did. So I didn't care that when we cut erasers, we were only saving a quarter, because symbolically, if you're not cutting everything, then people look at you wasting money in a category, and it may not be a lot of money, but then they say, well, why would we then cut back this, right? It's like, it has to be, everything is subject to a cut, right?
Absolutely.
There are no sacred cows,
Yeah.
right? And so
No.
if you don't do that, then that's when you have people push back and say, well, okay, put this exemption in. Well, the moment you put one in, you then get people lining up to put another one in. And I think we really need at the top this discipline to say, here's how we're going to turn the spending curve. Here's a trajectory. We know we're not going to fix this in a year, but I think people would be happy if they saw we could fix it in 10 years, right?
Yeah.
If they
And but I
saw
mean,
that.
you've got two options. You either raise more money or spend less money. And
Yeah.
raising more money for government means an increase in taxes. That's all there
Yeah.
is to it.
Well,
And
and
so,
part of the problem is too, is, government, if we raise taxes, we're just going to spend it, right? Like,
yep,
people have no confidence that if we raise taxes, that we'll actually stop
put it
spending.
put it towards the debt instead of just spend it or
Yeah.
send it to a different country at this point. And so, with all that, I appreciate your time today. I know you're a busy man. Leave us, just give us kind of your pitch. I mean, the primaries here, everybody's
Yeah.
filling out their ballots. Where are you at? What do you want to see? How do you want
Yeah.
to go?
Thanks, Carson. Thanks for having me on the show. Uh, like, you and I have to be careful, because if our bases feel like we actually like and respect each other, we're both in trouble, right?
Both.
You're the best. I just really loved working with you as chair, and you and I traveled the state together and spent a lot of time together. Look, if people are uncertain who they're going to vote for, I would just really say your choice is actually pretty easy. if you want somebody that's cut budgets, if you want somebody that has never voted for an omnibus, if you want somebody who you can call the day that you have a government problem, if you want somebody who's going to be effective and get things done for Utah in a conservative way, I'm your guy. And I'm not a natural bragger, you know that, but this is, if you're going to brag about yourself, now's the time. And so I'm grateful. I'm asking for people's vote and their support. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to be on part of your podcast today.
Nah, thanks for coming on. And like as I've told people in the past, I don't make endorsements very often. I don't do any of that because I want people to make their own decisions because educated voters are the best voters. And if you want to make a change, go educate yourself, do the research, go do your own. I'm not going to fill out your ballot for you, nor should you call somebody and say, who do I vote for? Go do your research, read about them, see what's actually, do it for yourself, and our country's going to be a lot better place. So thanks for coming on, John. Appreciate you taking the time and
See you
coming,
soon.
and
Okay.
catch y'all soon.